Well, welcome to Kepler Conversations. I'm Dr. Scott Postma. Kepler is an online marketplace for classical Christian education. We employ the historic university model and leverage the best available technology so that we can empower families by liberating teachers and make classical liberal arts education available, accessible, and affordable. Today, I'm joined by Cheryl Floyd. Cheryl married in 1990 and homeschooled her 7 children. She earned a humanities degree with honors at Faulkner University, completed the CiRCE Apprenticeship in 2021, and is a CiRCE Certified Master Teacher. Cheryl has tutored, directed, and spoken for classical conversations, local homeschool co-ops, and various education conferences. And most recently, she taught at CiRCE's Online Academy until the recent jointure with Kepler. Cheryl, welcome. Glad to have you today.
Glad to be here.
Well, let's get started talking a little bit about you and what you like to do. And we know that you're teaching here on the Kepler platform. We'll talk about your classes in a moment. But can you tell us a little bit, besides teaching, what you like to do? What is your life like? Who are you?
Well, it's funny when you read off the bio, I'm like, wow, I was supposed to be homeschooling. I was doing all this education myself. But anyone homeschooler knows, like, really, it's a both and. You know, I fell into the rabbit hole of education and I loved it. I loved to think about what causes people to learn, why they learn, how do they learn, the different ways that we learn, the historical, evolution and de-evolution of education. So that has been a bulk of my life and I've continued to enjoy it as a hobby. I'm not as I like to call myself a geek teacher, but when you get around real geeks and they're like episode 7 of Star Trek season 2, and I was like, oh, no. So I'm not that, much as I love to be. So I'm not as academic as I maybe wish I could be, but that has been a bulk of my time. But recently, since I'm down to 2 homeschoolers, I have fallen into the rabbit hole of sourdough baking. I am like knee deep. I love it. I stay up till 2 o'clock in the morning waiting for my dough to be bulk proofed and all these crazy things. So
my daughter does a lot of that. Do you do the little designs in the bread when it kind of?
I try. But see how classical it is? Like you're learning a skill and then you can bring it all the way to this artistic level because it includes beauty. But it still has to taste good. It still has to rise, So I'm still in that portion of it, of making sure I get a consistent rise and all that. But I love it. It's become addictive.
That's probably the far more important part than making the little designs in it. Right. Well, you mentioned, and I think this is true for a lot of classical educators, but mentioned that, while you're homeschooling, you're pursuing your own education. And I think that's, it's kind of par for the course. We love to educate because we like to get educated. I think it kind of goes both ways for a lot of educators. But one of the things that I've discovered, and this is true of myself, that not all classical educators were classically educated themselves. Matter of fact, most probably weren't. Can you tell us a little bit about before Faulkner, like what was your education growing up? What sparked this desire for classical education in your own life?
I wonder how often any of us do this, often think back and look and sort of begin to assess how good was our education. I think I had it pretty good in the late 70s and early 80s in small town Texas. I had a really great 6th grade teacher. That's the year that always sticks out in my mind. Maybe it was pivotal because that was fractions, that was certain science concepts, certain writing and grammar that began to come together that I just really did well at. And then from that point forward, social aspects became more important to me. So I don't want to judge the educators too harshly because I myself did not continue to participate in my education until my 20s. It's like I recovered. I began to read books like Animal Farm or it was George Mueller's autobiography when I was nursing my babies at night. I thought, let me go back and read. And I kind of judged myself at a 7th grade education. And so I just looked up, some book lists and I really began to re-educate myself. And then of course I started homeschooling and then my journey really began from there.
Wow, that's amazing. Well, I don't feel too hard on those educators either, just in that, they got what was given to them. And really that's what classical education is, trying to recover that inheritance that used to be passed on. And so I think we were all in there. I'm interested to talk a little bit about the courses that you're teaching, and I'm really excited actually to talk about them. You have a couple of summer courses that are geared toward adults, and then of course your fall courses, and we've talked about this before a little bit about film as literature. Can you talk about what you're teaching this fall and the summer?
So in the summer, since that's coming first,
Yeah.
my experience has been that the struggle for teachers, whether they're homeschool, private school, public school, is often lesson planning. Many teachers really struggle with writing because it seems subjective. And of course, there are subjective aspects to it, like the artistic aspects and the stylistic aspects. But really, there are concrete things that we can and ought to be teaching our students. And so I have a way of structuring lesson plans that you can do that. So I have a specific course for, and it's only 4 weeks, 2 hours each week. So you get 8 lessons in a month's time, and you'll be prepared really forever to do really any lessons with this structure. But some people might not only want writing and they don't want it to be writing specific. And so I also offer the course for how to teach any lesson. And then there's a lot of people. I have a sort of specialty with lost tools, which is a CiRCE curriculum. I was trained on it through the apprenticeship, and then I've taught it through CiRCE for many years. I also taught it or tutored it with Classical Conversations, as well as my own children. And so I have a specific summer course, same concept, 4 weeks, 2 hours each week, of introducing and helping lesson plan for Lost Tools 1 and Lost Tools 2. And then in the fall, I'm very excited.
Can I interrupt you before you go on? I apologize to do that, but can you tell me, who are these geared for? Are these for like teachers teaching students, homeschool moms teaching their kids? Who would benefit from these courses you're teaching in the summer?
I think anybody who needs to come up with a plan for how to approach a lesson or a concept or a skill.
Okay, very good. So I apologize to interrupt you. I wanted to get that in there because I think that's helpful. Sometimes people feel like, well, maybe this isn't for me. I'm not a teacher, but I think these are very valuable tools that they'll be gaining. So yeah, please talk about your fall classes as well.
Yeah, so the fall is going to be for high school students, and it'll be covering Lost Tools 1 with film as our literature. So we'll look at films through the lens of literature. What kind of themes, what are the scopes, what's the character development, what's the plot line, and then we'll use the narrative of each film to go through the Lost Tools curriculum. So that will be for Lost Tools 1 and for Lost Tools 2. Both have the same films, except for Lost Tools 1, we start out with Karate Kid, which I think, the original, of course, I think it does a great job of really explaining sometimes what seems like a strange or weird thing you're being asked to do, or even almost like a slave type thing to do. Daniel thought he felt like he was Mr. Miyagi's slave. You're just getting me to do all this work. And it was really training for his success. And it's a great film about the difference between virtue and just winning to win, or winning at all costs. So I love to start out Lost Tools with that, so that children can kind of maybe play the long game and realize these forms may seem monotonous or difficult now, but they really are going to lead to something. And if I participate, then I gain virtue. So Lost Tools 2 is about the deliberative address. And so that starts out with 12 Angry Men, also the original. So it's a great courtroom case. It really sets up the whole rest of the year, watching that film and keeping that in the back of your mind of the things that they did with the evidence and with eyewitness testimony and all that kind of thing.
As a classical educator myself, I always get this question from folks who are just entering in, to the classical world, and they'll say things like, why read pagan literature if we're Christians, right? This is the question that we're always answering. So I'm going to throw one of those at you, playing the devil's advocate for a moment. And so film wouldn't, in some people's minds, be a classical thing. How can this fit into a classical curriculum if we're using something that's modern like film?
Well, so for one, I would say eventually you have to take your classical education and formation and go out into the world. And so in the classroom, I'm the classical thing. I'm not the most classical thing in the world, or even at Kepler. There's amazing teachers at Kepler. It's a little bit intimidating. But in my little bit of education, I bring that to the students and I give them classical eyes. I teach them how to look at something like film, or even like the curriculum, Lost Tools. I mean, most of our curriculum isn't classical, either it doesn't come from, Socrates or from St. John Chrysostom or whoever the early fathers, of the church are. So I'm the thing that brings the classical element. And the hope is to do some formation of their souls to get them a little bit further down the classical road to becoming more human, to perceiving more of the true, the good, and the beautiful. And if there's anything true or good and beautiful, which what is that in Philippians, meditate on these things. So if there's anything in these films that's true and good and beautiful and reflects some timeless themes, some timeless ideas, some timeless story arcs, then we should meditate on those things. We should look at them and recognize them for what they are.
I love that answer. I love it because one of the confusing or misconceptions, I guess, that people think about classical education, they think, well, we're trying to take everybody back in the 1950s, or we want to go even further back and go, to the Victorian age or something even further, medieval Christendom. And that's not at all what classical education is all about, but recovering those tools for learning. And what you're introducing to film is so important. And I think it goes all the way across literature. And so I love that answer.
I would say, I'm sorry, I would say it's recovering the remembrance of what it is to be human. That's what began to be lost. The truth is that we're the image of God, and we're meant to be creators also and to appreciate his creation. And so it's a recovery of humanity, right? That's lost in the fall, that's lost with each iteration, that's lost with postmodernism, all the things that we complain about. The humanity is higher than those things because it's in the image of God. And so we really can teach our children to transcend. And when you can get up on the mountain of transfiguration with the Lord and look down on something like politics or whatever the trend is, you can do it with love and peace and patience and hopefully wisdom and prudence.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the most human things about us, right, is that we're storytellers and we think in terms of narratives. And so, I love that.
That's good.
Are you teaching any other courses? What else are you teaching in the fall? I didn't want to.
That's it. Is Law Schools 1 and 2 in the fall. I think that's going to be plenty for me. I still have a Latin apprenticeship that I'm finishing up. So maybe in 2026, 27, I offer a Latin class. Maybe not. Maybe I'm just going to have Latin for myself so I can read Winnie il Pooh or, Habitus or whatever, or the Aeneid.
I love that we have such great versatile teachers that can teach literature, film, Latin, and that's amazing. Can you tell us a little bit maybe about a course? Is there a particular, a vignette? Maybe you give us a little taste of what's in your course. I know we've talked about a couple of the films, and I think those are wonderful introductions to what you're doing there. And I think that's very beautifully done, by the way. But are there any other little vignettes or little insights that might be interesting that somebody might take away and cause them to ponder about the courses that you're teaching?
Well, so in the how-to courses, when I was going back through what I've learned about how to structure a lesson that you want to convey to a student, and I was really meditating and contemplating how would I structure a course for adults who haven't gone through apprenticeship or haven't heard of the mimetic way of teaching or anything like that. And I really came across this idea of when the students can perceive the logos, the principle of your lesson, they then become living epistles. Just like Paul was commending to the saints, right? He was saying, what do you need from me? Another letter? You're it. You're the living letter. The proof is in the pudding, right? So as soon as my students can learn to perceive a lesson, they become that much closer to learning how to perceive the Lord and to become living epistles of him too. So that's in the how-to courses. I'm very excited to share those kind of nuggets throughout the whole 8 lessons. And then with the film course, as I've been structuring it, I've been thinking about, because we are classical and we don't just watch a thing or, we don't just see a thing. It's natural for human beings to want to do a thing. And this is even in Norms Nobility, where David Hicks is saying there should be an inspiration to want to do. And so that's why you want to be careful what you set before students' eyes, right? You don't want to film where someone's stealing and that's the good thing, because they'll want to imitate it, especially the younger and younger they are. And if they know not to imitate it, then they begin to kind of shut themselves off because they know not to do that. And so then they have to shut themselves off from the rest of the film. So anyway, a couple of questions I'll be asking in a film journal every week will be a virtue question, which is something like, what lesson in character or virtue stood out to you most? How can you apply it to your own life? I'm going to ask a wonder question. Which moment in the film made you feel a sense of awe or surprise or inspiration, and why? And I'm going to ask a self-reflective question. Have you ever felt like an outsider? So like for the Karate Kid, like Daniel did, how did you respond when you felt like an outsider? How do you wish you had responded? So I'm excited for the students to engage in the literature, which is our films, in a more productive and personal way that I think is very classical, because we should always be striving to be formed, by virtue and piety and by Christ ultimately.
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely love that. You, there's a statement in your bio that I wanted to ask you about that I loved it, but it says that Cheryl often brings up Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, and Harry Potter as examples in class, and then hashtag geek teacher. This is, it cracked me up. Can you talk about that a little bit? What's going on there?
I am a wannabe geek. I mean, I kind of referenced it at the beginning. When I get around real geeky people who know the chapter and verse of Dune where, Arrakis, this and that happens. And I'm just sort of lamenting because I wish I could be deeper like that, but I love geeky things. And I asked ChatGPT, it's my new friend. I'm kind of on and off about AI. I laugh at it because I certainly don't want it implanted in my brain. But sometimes, you go and you play around, you ask it questions. And so I asked it to make me a meme of Martin Luther looking like Gandalf with a Jedi robe and Dobby next to him and putting on there the truth lies with the geeks. Because we know Martin Luther said the truth lies with the Greeks, and whether he was speaking of Orthodoxy or just Eastern, Socrates and the Greeks in general. But either way, this idea, mythos is clothing for truth. So Jesus is the incarnation of God. He's fully God, fully man. And so myths were not lies, or even when we say fairy tales, fairy tales are always pointing to the truth. And so I think that geeks are often like pagans, if they're not Christians, groping in the dark, but groping for the truth. They seek the supernatural, they seek the other, the mystery, the deeper magic. And so I'm a geek teacher. I love all of it.
I love that too. C.S. Lewis, in his little short, it's a longer essay, but in a shorter work for C.S. Lewis, De Descriptione Temporum, where he talks about the description of times and where we break up history. But he says that, during his time, he said, I hear people all the time saying that we're becoming pagan again, that in England we're becoming pagan. And he said, we're not at all. We're becoming post-Christian, right? And he said, I really wish we were becoming pagan, because then we might be closer to Christianity. We might be on our way back, back there. He said it might be interesting to see a white bull sacrificed on the steps of Westminster because those myths get us closer to, even if the object of the worship or the object of the idea isn't what Christianity is, it gets us much closer to seeing reality for what it really is.
Yes.
So yeah, I love that.
I think we have a generation of skeptics, not just because of nihilism infiltrating the culture, but because of the lack of fairy tales and good mythos at an early age. My children have grown too old now. They think, for a really good myth and story and sweet children's books. And now I'm just reading children's books like they are the Aeneid, because there's just no pretense. They're just beautiful, like older, like Men of the Mississippi, and I can't think of the other ones that are, but it's like that set of 3 that are geography books. Just beautiful myths, right? Greek myths, Roman myths. When you're saying earlier, well, that's pagan, but the pagans became Christians, which you're referring to. And why did they become Christians? Because they were populated in their souls with that longing for the truths behind the myths, right? Not for Zeus, but for a God man who would help them and save them and be good to them, right?
Yep, absolutely. Well, you see that you mentioned Paul quoting a little bit from Paul earlier when in Acts 17, where he talks, at the Areopagus, that they are groping, right? They're groping toward God, but Christ came down to us. And that's really the way we see the pagans, is looking back, that they're groping toward. We even borrow from Plato. We Christians, we borrow the word theology, right? We get that from Plato. That's not originally a Christian word, except in the sense that Plato is groping, or Socrates is groping for God. So I love that. I love that picture of mythos. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to chat today. Do you have any final parting words for the audience before we let you go?
I mean, for homeschoolers, it's a fearful thing that we embark on, and we're seeing more fruit that can help us, that kind of lights the path, but it's still fearful when it's your own child. And so in my own experience, with the last two being 15 and 17, really trust God and really pour into the relationship, and don't worry as much about the academics. Like, eventually you have to hand off their education to them. But the relationship, you still have to be responsible for your part. And then with teachers, somehow you have to figure out how to not make it about the grade. You really have to make it about the soul, and about reaching them, not necessarily being their friend, but really bridging the gap, especially with the hard things like Dante, or like even Frankenstein, writing, any of the things, chemistry, calculus. The harder it is, the more I think you have to make it palatable. And that's our job as teachers, is to try and win their souls, not necessarily their approval, right? But definitely their souls.
I feel like we're wrapping up with a game of Jeopardy, where you just gave the answer, and I'm going to say, what is paideia, right? Because that's what you just described. So Cheryl, thank you so much, and really looking forward to your classes flourishing this year, and really glad to have you on the Kepler platform.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be a part of Kepler.